The water in the wooden laundering vats had frozen over twice since dawn. Sela Sterling broke the thin layer of ice with the edge of her wooden paddle, ignoring the caustic bite of lye stinging her cracked knuckles. The heavy court linens demanded a brutal rhythm to clean, and the northern winter did not forgive idle hands. Steam rose from the boiling pots on the far side of the cellar, hitting the cold stone walls and immediately turning to frost. Beside her, Nellie wrung out a massive wool cloak, her jaw set tight. Her sister worked with a punishing energy that usually preceded a political storm. Up in the great hall, the southern envoy had arrived. The entire lower level of Winterstone hummed with the frantic anxiety of servants trying to anticipate the demands of dangerous men. They say he brought 50 armed trackers. A scullery maid whispered from the next vat, her voice barely carrying over the slosh of wet fabric. They say he will not leave without the tribute. Sela kept her eyes on the linen. She knew exactly what Gregory Vane wanted. The southern territories were collapsing under the weight of the pack plague, their borders rotting from the inside out. Lord Vane had not come for gold or timber. He had come for the quiet herbalist, who spent her nights grinding roots and reading a dead woman's notes. She pressed her forearm against her ribs. Beneath her rough-spun apron, the heavy, parchment-bound spine of the mother's journal rested securely against her side. The ancient volume held the botanical mixtures, the old blood oaths, and the exact ratios required to neutralize the venom. It was the only reason the envoy had marched his trackers through a blinding blizzard. To him, she was not a person, but a resource to be claimed, locked in a southern apothecary, and worked until her hands gave out. "Keep your head down," Nellie murmured, leaning close enough that the scent of her lavender soap masked the lie. "If his men come down here, you are just a laundress. You know nothing of the sickness." Sela nodded, pulling a sodden sheet from the freezing water. The weight of it dragged at her shoulders. She had spent enough of her life learning not to speak in front of people who would only weaponize her words. The keep's hierarchy was a rigid, unforgiving machine, and the safest place for an Omega without a titled protector was deep in the shadows, covered in soap and silence. A sharp clatter of iron boots on the cellar stairs shattered the rhythm of the room. 2 guards descended into the steam, their tabards bearing the direwolf crest. The entire laundry froze. Maids dropped their paddles. "The herbalist," the lead guard announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceiling. "The sovereign king requires her presence in the great hall." Nellie's hand shot out, gripping Sela's wrist underwater. Her sister's fingers were trembling against the cold. Sela gently pulled her hand free. She dried her raw palms on her apron, feeling the solid grounding edge of the journal beneath the cloth. She did not look at the other maids. She simply turned and followed the guards up the stone steps, leaving the bitter scent of lye behind. The great hall hit her with overwhelming heat. The air smelled of roasted venison, rich wine, and the sharp, resinous tang of burning cedar. Sela stopped just inside the heavy oak doors, keeping her gaze angled slightly downward, reading the geometry of the room before looking at the faces. The court was heavily guarded. A ring of northern soldiers lined the walls, their hands resting casually near their hilts. In the center of the room stood Vane. The southern envoy wore tailored velvet and carried himself with the smooth, performative arrogance of a man accustomed to buying whatever he could not conquer. At the head of the hall, seated on a throne of dark iron and carved oak, sat Alistair Thorne. The Alpha King occupied the space with crushing inevitability. He did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice. He watched the envoy with a cold, unreadable stillness that made the surrounding lords shift nervously in their boots. "The treaty is simple, Your Grace," Vane said, his voice slick with false diplomacy. "The southern packs will honor the border lines. We will withdraw our hunters from the Whispering Glen. In exchange, we take the girl." He gestured lazily toward the back of the hall. She possesses the plague cure. My territory requires it. A small price to pay for lasting peace. Sela stood perfectly still. The heat of the fire pressed against her damp clothes, but an absolute cold settled in her stomach. She was a single, wolfless woman holding a book of weeds. To the lords of the court, she was a math equation, a fraction of a territory, a tradable asset. Alistair finally shifted. The faint clinking of his chainmail beneath his heavy wolfskin cloak was the only sound in the cavernous room. He looked past Vane. For a fraction of a second, his dark, calculating gaze locked onto Sela standing by the doors. The weight of his attention was physical. Sela reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against a small, fragile object, the pressed winter flower, a rare violet bloom she had found near the frozen river weeks ago, a quiet reminder that life could endure the deepest frost. She had carried it every day since. Will you truly risk a border war over a common servant, Alistair? Vane pressed, stepping closer to the throne. Give me the herbalist. Let us seal this pact. The entire hall waited. The northern lords watched their sovereign, calculating the political cost of a refusal. Protecting one Omega with ink-stained fingers made no strategic sense. Alistair leaned his head back against the iron throne. His expression remained utterly blank, a mask of bored indifference. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant drawl that carried to every corner of the room. Take her. She isn't worth fighting for. Sela felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. It lodged itself beneath her ribs, right beside the heavy edge of her mother's journal. She did not gasp. She did not flinch. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. If she pleaded with the king for mercy, it would only entertain Vane. It would only prove she was weak enough to be owned. The southern envoy smiled, a sharp, triumphant curling of his lips. He turned toward Sela, his eyes sweeping over her damp apron and calloused hands with open greed. Sela held her posture rigid. She bowed to the king, a slow, deep, mathematically perfect execution of court protocol. Not a plea, but an exit. As she straightened, she opened her hand inside her pocket. The fragile dried petals of the pressed winter flower slipped from her fingers. It fluttered noiselessly to the cold stone floor, landing in the shadow of the heavy oak doors. She did not look back at the iron throne. She turned her back on the heat, the lords, and the sovereign who had just discarded her, and walked quietly back into the cold. The air in the cellar room was stagnant, holding the permanent dampness of riverstone and the sharp bite of lye soap. It was a space designed strictly for labor, offering no warmth as Sela Sterling knelt beside her single wooden trunk. She folded her thick woolen tunics, smoothing the coarse fabric down with hands that deliberately refused to tremble. Behind her, Nellie Sterling paced the narrow floorboards. The older woman's boots struck the stone with a frantic, uneven rhythm, betraying the raw fury she could no longer suppress. You cannot simply accept this, Nellie said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the sound would not carry. He humiliated you in front of the entire court, before Vane, before the elders. You should march back up those stairs and demand to be heard. You are not a scrap to be casually discarded to appease a southern warlord. Sela did not look up from her work. She reached for a bundle of dried comfrey, testing the brittle green stems with her thumb to ensure the damp air had not spoiled them. If I march back up those stairs, I validate the insult, she answered, her tone perfectly level, and I invite Lord Vane to view me as a prize worth pursuing. The king explicitly stated I was not worth fighting for. The most dangerous thing I could do right now is attempt to prove him wrong. She set the comfrey carefully into a canvas pouch, tying the drawstring tight. Beside it went a small tin of crushed yarrow, a wooden vial of pine resin, and a tightly bound bundle of shaved willow bark. Her movements were precise, the measured calculations of a woman, cataloguing her physical resources, for impending winter survival. Pride did not burn in a stone hearth, and it did not brew into medicine. "It is cowardice," Nellie snapped, stopping sharply at the edge of the frayed rug. "It is the king protecting his own political standing while throwing you out into the freezing mud." He did not even look at you when he said it. "Then we will not look back at him," Sela replied quietly. She reached beneath the loose floorboard under her narrow cot and withdrew the most critical item in the room. The mother's journal was heavy, its thick parchment pages bound in ancient leather. She ran her fingertips over the cover, feeling the familiar grooves of her family's legacy. This single volume held the only complete record of botanical mixtures capable of treating the pack plague. She took a square of heavy oiled cloth, smelling faintly of beeswax, and laid it flat over her knees. Sela wrapped the journal meticulously, folding the stiff corners tight to protect the fragile paper from winter moisture. She tied the bundle off with a length of raw leather cord, pulling the knot taut. She did not cry. The public lie had been delivered. The court had witnessed it, and the consequence was immediate exile. Tears would not fortify the walls of their destination. "We are leaving for the glen," Sela stated, placing the wrapped journal at the bottom of her trunk beneath her cloaks. "Pack your thickest wool, Nellie. The sky is turning grey, and we have a very long walk before dusk. Leaving the servants' quarters required, navigating a labyrinth of arched stone corridors that echoed with the daily machinery of the pack. Sela carried her trunk by a single leather handle, the weight pulling her right shoulder down, while Nellie walked a half-step behind with their canvas bags. They did not sneak out through the kitchen postern. Sela chose the primary gate, walking straight through the center of the keep, with her spine held rigidly straight. The whispers began immediately. Guards standing at attention near the armory lowered their pikes a fraction of an inch, exchanging sideways glances. Kitchen maids, carrying buckets of ash, stopped in the middle of the courtyard, their voices dropping into hushed murmurs as the discarded herbalist walked past. They were looking for signs of devastation. They were waiting to see a broken woman dragging her feet in shame. Sela's offered them nothing. Her chin remained level, her gaze fixed entirely on the massive iron portcullis ahead. Keeping her peace served as a subtle defense, sparing her the heavy toll of engagement. By refusing to acknowledge the stares, she stripped the onlookers of their power to pity her. She was not fleeing in disgrace. She was merely departing a structure that no longer required her services. "They are staring," Nellie muttered, her grip tightening on her canvas straps until her knuckles turned stark white. "Let them," Sela murmured back, her breath plumbing faintly in the frigid air. "By tomorrow, they will have a new scandal to occupy their time. Keep your eyes on the gate." The heavy iron gates of Winterstone Keep stood open to the northern road. 4 armored sentries stepped aside without a word. The iron bars were thick with morning frost, and the stone archway overhead cast a long, grey shadow across the packed dirt of the threshold. Sela paused exactly at the boundary line, where the keep's courtyard ended and the untamed borderlands began. She set the heavy trunk down on the frozen earth for a single, deliberate moment. The wind howling down from the northern peaks hit her immediately, a brutal, biting current of air that smelled of crushed pine needles and impending snow. It was freezing, harsh enough to chap the skin within minutes, but as it washed over her face, she did not flinch. Instead, Sela reached up and pulled her thick woolen hood over her dark hair. Out here in the vast expanse of the winter forest, there were no envoys demanding tribute, and no kings offering cruel dismissals. There was only the wood, the snow, and the quiet truth of survival. "Are you ready?" Nellie asked, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with her sister, her previous anger settling into a grim resolve. "I am," Sela said, adjusting her grip on the worn leather handle, without a backward glance at the towering stone walls. Sela stepped over the threshold and walked into the freezing afternoon, bound for the deep isolation of Whispering Glen. The cottage in Whispering Glen had stood empty for 5 winters. The oak door groaned against rusted hinges, scraping a deep arc into the frost-hardened dirt as Sela Sterling forced it open. Inside, fading grey light spilled across a single room thick with undisturbed dust and the scent of dried pine needles. Sela did not pause to mourn her exile. She stepped across the threshold, her boots leaving sharp imprints on the ash-covered floorboards. Nellik dropped her canvas satchel onto a wooden table. The wood creaked, a hollow sound emphasizing their isolation. "The chimney will be blocked with snow," Nelly said. "I will clear the draught and fetch dry wood. Do not stop moving, Sela. The cold in these stone walls will settle into your bones if you sit." Sela offered a short nod. She untied her cloak and located an old bristled broom in the corner. The labor required no thought, only a steady rhythm of muscle and breath. She swept the accumulated dirt toward the hearth, the scratching of the bristles serving as a quiet metronome. Near the fireplace, a thick floorboard sat misaligned. Sela knelt, ignoring the ache in her frozen joints, and wedged her fingers into the gap. The wood groaned as she pried it upward, revealing a small hollow beneath the foundation. Inside rested a length of oiled leather tied with a rawhide string. She pulled the bundle free and unwrapped it. The silver-tipped knife lay perfectly balanced in her palm, its polished surface catching the dim light. Sela ran her thumb along the razor-sharp edge, feeling the deliberate resistance of the metal. Her mother had used this blade to shave willow bark, but it was forged from high-carbon steel with enough weight to split bone. Holding it grounded her. The knife asked no questions. It existed solely to perform the work required. Sela slipped the weapon into her apron pocket just as Nelly returned with pale birch logs. Together, they knelt before the blackened hearth. Sela struck the flint against the iron striker, sending bright orange sparks into the dry tinder. Smoke curled upward, followed by the tentative crackle of a small flame. As the fire threw its amber warmth against the stone, Sela stared into the rising heat. Her hands were stained with soot, her knuckles cracked from the wind, and her breathing was steady. The silence of the remote valley wrapped around the cabin. There were no arrogant envoys here, no false treaties and no watchful eyes. There was only the wood, the knife, and the absolute necessity of survival. The lower armory of Winterstone Keep smelled of rendered tallow, cold iron, and weapon oil. The grand hearth above might have been filled with complacent lords, praising the king's pragmatic indifference. But the subterranean air below held the tense stillness of a drawn bowstring. Alistair Thorne stood by a scarred workbench, tightening the thick leather straps of his steel breastplate. His movements were unhurried, driven by the cold precision that always preceded violence. Thomas Croft stepped out of the shadows near the weapon racks, a dark woolen cloak draped over his armor. The captain of the border guard moved without a sound, carrying a rolled parchment map. "They ignored the decree," Croft said, his voice low enough that the echo died against the damp walls. "Lord Vane accepted your public dismissal of the girl, but his southern trackers left the keep an hour ago, 5 of them, fully armed. They are moving rapidly through the western pine corridor." Alistair did not look up from his steel buckles. "They are heading for the glen. They believe she is unprotected," Croft confirmed, unfurling the map. "Because you told the court she held no value. Vane intends to seize her quietly tonight, knowing you cannot launch a formal pack war over an exiled herbalist without losing the support of your elders." Alistair paused his preparations. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew an incredibly fragile object. It was the pressed winter flower. The violet petals were bruised and flattened, crushed beneath heavy boots on the great hall floor before he had quietly salvaged it from the shadows of the oak doors. Holding the tiny bloom between his calloused fingers, Alistair studied the delicate petals. It was a remnant of her steadfast presence, a small piece of resilience left behind in a room that had offered her nothing but calculated cruelty. Alistair tucked the fragile flower into the inner padding of his gauntlet. The metal clanked softly as he flexed his armored fingers, securing the bloom against his palm. "I have no intention of launching a formal war," Alistair said, his voice devoid of inflection. He reached for his massive broadsword, sliding it smoothly into the scabbard strapped across his back. "A war requires witnesses and tedious council votes. A war gives Vane the opportunity to retreat and negotiate." Croft crossed his arms. "And a skirmish in the deep woods. If Vane's men freeze to death while pursuing a shadow, it is merely a tragedy of the harsh northern winter," Alistair replied. He secured his wolfskin cloak over his shoulders. "Deploy your men to secure the outer perimeter. Ensure no reinforcements leave Vane's encampment." "And the trackers already in the woods?" Croft asked quietly. "I will handle them." Alistair pulled his leather hood up, casting his features into deep shadow. He did not speak of the cold fury in his chest, nor did he mention the suffocating weight of the lie he had been forced to speak in the great hall. He turned and walked toward the hidden iron door leading out into the freezing night, leaving the armory to the absolute silence of the stone. The wind off the northern ridge did not just blow. It battered the thick timber walls of the Whispering Glen cottage with the steady, rhythmic force of a siege engine. Inside the cramped main room, the heavy oak table was illuminated by the sputtering golden light of a single tallow candle. Sela Sterling sat perfectly straight on the hard, splintered stool, her focus narrowed entirely to the small brass apothecary scale resting in front of her. The metal was freezing to the touch, biting into her calloused fingertips as she carefully calibrated the counterweights. She pulled the mother's journal closer to the wavering flame. The thick parchment pages were brittle at the edges, stained with decades of dried sap, faded ink spills, and the dark ghost of crushed petals. She did not look toward the reinforced door. She did not listen to the howling blizzard that threatened to rip the wooden shingles from the roof. Instead, the young herbalist let the methodical, unyielding routine of her craft anchor her completely to the present moment. Her hands moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. She reached into a rough canvas sack and pulled out a handful of dried valerian root, allowing the pungent, earthy scent to fill the small room and push back the lingering smell of stale dust. She placed the twisted fibrous roots onto the left pan of the scale, watching the brass arm dip and sway with mathematical certainty. It required absolute precision. Too much valerian would slow a patient's heart to a dangerous crawl. Too little would fail to sedate the violent tremors of a severe fever. Across the room, Sela Sterling fed another thick, split log into the stone hearth. The fire popped and hissed loudly, sending a brief, desperate wave of orange heat across the uneven floorboards. Sela's eldest sister worked in relentless silence, her posture rigid, sweeping the lingering cobwebs from the dark corners with sharp, aggressive strokes of a straw broom. Sela added a pinch of dried chamomile to a separate linen square. The sweet, floral dust lifted briefly into the cold draught seeping under the window frame. She recorded the inventory in the crowded margins of the ancient book, her quill scratching a loud, steady rhythm against the rough paper. 4 ounces of valerian, 6 ounces of chamomile, 2 drams of crushed yarrow. The inventory was a survival tally, a physical proof that they could endure the isolation of the valley without relying on the court's charity or permission. The wooden shutters rattled violently against their heavy iron latches. Sela's hand paused over the brass scale. The wind sounded exactly like a pack of starving wolves tearing at the timber. She carefully tapped the remaining chamomile dust from her palms, refusing to let the mounting dread take root in her chest. She simply turned the page of the heavy journal, dipped her quill deep into the inkwell, and continued to count. The weight of the roots was real. The measurements were absolute. Everything else was just noise in the dark. Miles away, the blizzard had completely swallowed the dense pine forest, burying the world beneath a blinding, freezing sheet of white. The temperature had dropped so severely that the moisture in the air crystallized instantly, stinging exposed skin like shattered glass. Alistair Thorne moved through the deep, treacherous drifts without making a single sound. The heavy wolfskin cloak draped over his broad shoulders was already caked in a thick layer of ice, rendering him nearly invisible against the dark, frozen trunks of the ancient trees. He came to a sudden, absolute halt, his leather boots sinking past his knees in the fresh powder. Thomas Croft froze a fraction of a second later, his hand dropping instinctively to the leather-wrapped hilt of his short sword. In the brutal, unforgiving theatre of the winter woods, questions were a luxury that usually got men killed. The sovereign knelt deeply into the snow, ignoring the biting cold that seeped immediately through his heavy leather trousers. He removed his right glove, exposing his bare hand to the freezing wind, and reached out to touch a low-hanging pine branch. The wood was freshly snapped. Sap, still sticky and unfrozen, oozed sluggishly from the jagged pale break. It was a careless, arrogant mistake, the kind made by southern mercenaries who did not understand the geometric precision of the northern territories. Alistair traced the angle of the broken branch, calculating the exact trajectory of the men ahead. Below the disturbed pine needles, the faint outline of a heavy, spiked boot print was rapidly filling with snow. Lord Vane had not listened. The southern envoy's rogue scouts were pushing directly toward the valley boundary, ignoring the public declaration that the herbalist possessed no tactical value. Croft nodded once, fading backward into the tree line like a shadow detaching from the trunk to secure the perimeter. The silent coordination was absolute, born of years, fighting in the harshest conditions the territory had to offer. The king rose slowly to his feet, pulling his thick leather glove back over his numb fingers. He stared intently into the swirling curtain of snow, orienting his broad shoulders toward the hidden path that led directly to the Whispering Glen. There was no audience here to witness his supposed indifference. There was only the brutal, singular necessity of ensuring that the violent men advancing through the tree line never lived to see the morning sun. While the king hunted in the dark, the wind off the northern ridge hit the eastern wall of the cottage with the force of a physical blow. The old wood groaned in protest. Above the stone hearth, a heavy wooden shutter began to rattle in its iron frame, a rhythmic, violent clattering that threatened to let the freezing gale inside. Sela Sterling stood on a low stool, her breath pluming white in the drafty space. Her knuckles were raw and bright red from the dropping temperature, the skin pulled taut over delicate bones. She held a thick wooden wedge in her left hand. In her right hand, she gripped the silver-tipped knife. She did not use the blade. Instead, she inverted the tool, wrapping her freezing fingers around the cold metal of the crossguard, preparing to use the heavy flat pommel as a hammer. Below her, Nellie Sterling fed a pine log into the hearth, sending orange sparks up the soot-stained chimney. The elder sister watched the precarious balancing act, offering no useless warnings. A breached wall meant the frost would take the hearth, and without the fire, the cabin would become a tomb by dawn. Sela pressed the wooden wedge into the corner of the frame. She struck it with the butt of the sturdy tool. A resonant thud echoed over the howling wind. She struck it again. The wedge bit deeply into the rotting timber, forcing the shutter tight against the stone sill. The violent rattling ceased instantly, yet the draft persisted, a whistling knife of cold air slicing through the millimeter of space between wood and stone. Sela climbed down, moving to the wicker basket near the dying fire. She pulled out handfuls of unspun, raw sheep's wool from a forgotten chest. The lanolin coated her chapped skin, a heavy, greasy texture, offering a brief illusion of warmth. Returning to the window, she used the flat spine of the polished steel to pack the raw wool into the tiny fissures of the frame. She worked with methodical precision. Push, pack, seal. The wind screamed against the exterior, but the interior air began to still. She had spent her life learning that comfort was never given freely. It had to be built and defended by hand. The burning ache in her shoulders and the stinging bite in her fingertips were real, undeniable facts. They required no political maneuvering, no translation of royal intent. There was only the wind, the wool, and the knife. Nellie brought a tin cup of hot barley water to the edge of the sill. Seta wrapped her red hands around the hot tin, letting the heat bleed into her numb palms. She did not speak. In this isolated sanctuary, the profound quiet offered its own gentle comfort, demanding nothing in return. 2 miles to the east, where the elevation dropped sharply into a treacherous granite ravine. The storm was merely a backdrop to a different kind of violence. The narrow pass was the only viable approach to the Whispering Glen from the southern borders, a choke point flanked by vertical rock and ancient, snow-heavy pines. Alistair Thorne stood in the center of the defile. His heavy wolfskin cloak was dusted white, blending his massive frame into the frozen landscape. He did not move as the first of Lord Vane's mercenary hunters crested the ridge. There were 5 of them, moving with the aggressive confidence of men who believed their prey was an unprotected herbalist. They carried drawn steel and thick leather garrotes, their breath pluming in the dark. Alistair did not issue a challenge. A king in his own territory would traditionally announce his presence, demanding submission through a roaring battle cry. He refused to make a sound. If he claimed this kill as the sovereign of Winterstone, pack historians would record a skirmish at the borders of the glen. Vane would deduce that Sela held enough value to warrant the king's guard. The valley would cease to be a neutral sanctuary. When the lead tracker stepped within striking distance, Alistair lunged from the shadow of the pines. His movements were terrifyingly quiet. He caught the man by the throat, snapping his windpipe with a single twist of his armored gauntlet, before a shout could be formed. The body dropped softly into the deep powder. The remaining 4 mercenaries registered the ambush a fraction of a second too late. They swarmed him, expecting a feral rogue. Instead, they met the disciplined geometry of a sovereign trained in trench warfare. Alistair parried a downward broadsword strike with his left forearm, the heavy iron bracer taking the brunt of the impact. Simultaneously, he drove his hunting dagger upward, slipping the blade between the leather plates of his attacker's ribs. Blood sprayed dark against the pristine snow. The sharp, metallic scent of copper cut through the crisp odor of pine resin. Alistair ripped the blade free, pivoting to dodge a sweeping halberd swing that sheared off a pine branch beside his head. There was no grandeur here, only a suffocating, dirty struggle in knee-deep snow, defined by the sound of tearing fabric and wet impacts. A mercenary hooked a weighted chain around Alistair's calf, dragging him down to one knee. The icy crust bit through his woolen trousers, freezing the skin on contact. He did not stagger. He used the downward momentum to roll beneath a secondary strike, coming up in a crouch to sever the chain-wielder's hamstring. The man collapsed in silent agony. Alistair's lungs burned with the frigid air, his muscles aching with the sustained exertion of close-quarters combat. Every instinct in his blood urged him to unleash a dominant snarl, to terrify the remaining men into submission through raw pack authority. He swallowed the urge, locking his jaw tightly. He remained utterly mute, dismantling the squad with ruthless efficiency, ensuring no man would survive to report a royal presence in the woods. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to glowing orange coals. pushing back the freezing drafts leaking through the timber walls. Sela knelt on the uneven floorboards, using an iron poker to drag the flat baking stone away from the flames. Upon it rested a dense loaf of barley bread, its crust hardened and dusted with grey ash. Beside her, safely shielded from the damp floor on a dry linen cloth, was the mother's journal. The scent of roasted grain and rosemary filled the room. Nellie sat close by, her shoulders finally dropping from the rigid posture she had maintained since leaving Winterstone Keep. Sela did not wait for the loaf to cool. She pressed the heels of her hands against the hot crust, ignoring the sharp sting as she snapped it cleanly in two. Steam plumed upward into the cold air as she handed the larger portion to her sister. At the keep, meals were a performance of hierarchy, but here there were no watchful eyes to serve or evade. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling pine and the distant howl of the wind battering the thick shutters. The bread was heavy, but it tasted of survival. She would have liked this, Nellie said quietly, her eyes fixed on the embers. Their mother had built this hearth from river stones, weathering northern winters here, long before the sovereign court demanded her expertise. She survived worse storms than this, Sela answered, her voice measured. She brushed a scattering of crumbs from her dark linen skirt. She always said the keep was colder than the forest. They relied on stone to keep them warm. She relied on herself. Nellie took a slow bite. Stripped of their titles, they were simply two women with enough firewood to last the month. They think we are out here freezing, begging the stars for a way back into their good graces, she murmured with a dry edge of humour. Let them think it, Sela replied. The morning's public humiliation in the grand hearth room felt abstract now, entirely eclipsed by the sovereignty they held within these walls. They were not discarded omegas, waiting for a rescue that would never come. They were the masters of their own sanctuary, anchored by their mother's quiet competence. Miles away, the snow was no longer white. Deep in the whispering glen, the blizzard masked the sounds of violence, reducing a lethal confrontation to muffled grunts and the slide of steel against bone. Alistair stood over the motionless body of the final southern tracker, his chest heaving as the freezing air burned his lungs. Lord Vane's elite hunting party had been systematically dismantled before they could even glimpse the smoke from the herbalist's chimney. As Alistair turned, his heavy boots crunching into the blood-soaked frost, a severe tearing sensation ripped through his left shoulder. He staggered, the dark woods tilting violently. During the final clash, the last assassin had slipped a serrated dagger past his guard. The cut was not deep, but a metallic burn radiating from the wound proved it was coated in a fast-acting southern venom designed to rot tissue. A creeping, terrifying numbness was already replacing the initial fire in his arm. Croft emerged from the shadows of the tree line, his own blade dripping dark crimson. The head of the border guard took one look at his king's pale face and closed the distance. "You are hit," Croft stated, his voice laced with tactical alarm. Alistair leaned heavily against the frozen bark of a pine trunk. The wood was icy, biting through his layers, but it held his failing balance. When Croft reached to inspect the darkened, swollen flesh, Alistair physically batted his hands away with the absolute authority of a king. "Leave it," he ordered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The veins in your neck are blackening, sire," Croft countered, pointing back toward the fortress. "That is nightshade resin. If we turn back now, the royal healers can purge it." "We do not turn back." Alistair ground his teeth, fighting the dark tremor shaking his massive frame. "If we return to the keep, Lord Vane will know we were out here. He will know the public dismissal was a lie, and he will send a second party." Croft stepped closer, blocking the brutal wind from his sovereign's injured side. "You cannot protect her if you are dead." The hollow ache in his chest had nothing to do with the venom. He had publicly humiliated the woman he was bound to protect to shield her from the political machinery of the court, and this agonizing deterioration was the cost of that deception. "We hold the line," Alistair breathed, pushing himself off the frozen pine. He oriented himself toward the deeper woods, toward the faint pull of the hidden valley. "Tell the guard to lock down the perimeter. I am continuing forward to the boundary." Without waiting for protest, the wounded king forced his uncooperative legs to move, disappearing slowly into the white void of the storm. The sudden shift in the wind woke Sela Sterling instantly. It was not the usual low howl of the northern winter beating against the stone foundation of the cottage. It was a sharp, stuttering whistle, the kind of sound air makes when it rushes through a newly broken gap in the tree line. She opened her eyes to the pitch-black ceiling. Beside her, in the narrow adjacent room, Nellie's breathing remained steady and deep, the exhausted rhythm of a woman who had spent the entire day hauling firewood and mending cracked shutters. Sela did not move her head right away. She let her senses stretch outward, mapping the perimeter of their isolated sanctuary in the Whispering Glen. Through the subtle changes in temperature and sound, the draught seeping beneath the heavy oak door carried the faint biting scent of ozone and disturbed pine needles. Moving with practiced silence, Sela slipped out from beneath the heavy woolen blankets. The cold wooden floorboards shocked her bare feet, the deep winter freeze radiating upward through the timber, but she did not flinch. She crossed the small room using the familiar grooves of the wood, stepping over the joints that she knew would creak. The hearth in the main room had burned down to a pile of glowing, ash-covered embers. Beside the mortar, resting exactly where she had left it after shaving willow bark earlier, was the silver-tipped knife. Sela wrapped her fingers around the worn leather hilt. The cold metal of the pommel pressed into her palm, a heavy, weighted reassurance in the dark. She took a position near the stone chimney, pressing her shoulder blades against the freezing masonry to anchor herself. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of the reinforced front door and the narrow, frost-rimmed window. Sela began to calculate her defensive geometry, counting the long, distorted shadows thrown by the dying embers. One shadow fell across the heavy wooden table. Another stretched toward the pantry door. If the front hinges gave way, the intruders would funnel through the narrow entry, blinded momentarily by the darkness of the interior. She knew exactly how many steps it would take to reach the threshold, exactly where the floor dipped, exactly how to swing the blade in the tight quarters of the cabin. She stood perfectly still, controlling her breath, holding the knife low by her side. The silence of the cabin pressed inward, heavy with anticipation. Sela watched the frost crystallize on the window pane, listening to the branches scrape against the slate roof, waiting for the wind to carry another warning. Her grip on the hilt tightened, the silver tip gleaming faintly in the amber light. She was the invisible observer, the overlooked herbalist, but in the dark of her own home, she was the absolute authority on the space she occupied. She stood barefoot on the ice-cold planks, breathing in the scent of dried comfrey and wood smoke, refusing to yield a single inch of her sanctuary. A mile away, across the frozen boundary line of the valley, Alistair Thorne was losing his battle against the cold. The poisoned slash across his shoulder burned with a sickening, localized heat that contradicted the freezing temperatures of the deep woods. He dragged his right boot through the heavy snowdrift, his body listing heavily to one side. The massive Alpha King, whose very presence commanded the immediate silence of the grand hall, was now reduced to a staggering, solitary figure in the dark. He drove the point of his heavy broadsword into the frozen earth, using the weapon as a crude, desperate crutch to keep himself upright. Every step was an unglamorous exertion of pure will. His breath froze instantly onto the thick wool of his dark collar, crusting his jaw in a layer of white frost. Blood, thick and sluggish from the cold, continued to seep from the gash beneath his armor, soaking through the layers of linen and freezing into stiff, dark patches on his cloak. He had ordered Thomas Croft to take the surviving guards and sweep the northern ridge, ensuring none of Lord Vane's trackers could circle back to the keep. Alistair had taken the final, most dangerous perimeter himself, intentionally drawing the deadliest of the assassins away from the Whispering Glen. He had succeeded in breaking the strike team, leaving their bodies buried in the snow, but the cost was currently paralyzing his nervous system. He paused, leaning heavily on the hilt of his sword, his muscles trembling violently under the strain. The world blurred at the edges, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of grey trees and relentless white snow. The venom in his bloodstream was a specialized southern compound, designed to slow the heart and induce a lethargic, painless death. Alistair bit the inside of his cheek until the sharp, coppery taste of his own blood spiked through the haze, forcing his mind back into focus. He refused the temptation to close his eyes. He refused the quiet, beckoning silence of the snowbank. Through the dense, skeletal branches of the pine trees, a faint amber glow flickered in the distance. It was the low light of a hearth fire, seeping through the cracks of a wooden shutter. The sight of that meager illumination struck him with a force greater than any physical blow. He dragged his sword out of the ice and forced his left leg forward. The gravel and frost bit into his heavy boots, but he no longer felt his feet. He felt only the mechanical necessity of moving forward. He could not fall here. If he died in the woods, secondary scouts might eventually find the cabin, and the women would have no warning. The Sovereign stumbled, his knees slamming into the hard, frozen mud. The impact rattled his teeth, sending a shockwave of blinding pain through his poisoned shoulder. He let out a low, ragged breath, his gloved hands slipping against the icy crust of the snow. For a long moment, the Alpha King remained on his knees in the dark, the wind tearing at his ruined cloak. Then, with a slow exhalation of absolute defiance, he planted the sword back into the earth and hauled his massive frame upward. He did not march as a conqueror. He dragged himself forward step by grueling step, driven entirely by the need to keep the violence of the world far away from the woman he had publicly forsaken. Dawn broke over the Whispering Glen in shades of bruised purple and brittle grey. The blizzard had exhausted its fury during the long, dark hours, leaving behind an assailance, so absolute it felt heavy against the timber walls. Sela Sterling sat near the dying embers of the hearth. She had not slept. The erratic shifting of the wind had kept her vigilant, her mind cataloguing the remaining firewood and the dried roots stored in the cellar. Then came the sound. It was not the sharp crack of a falling pine bough or the scraping of ice against the eaves. It was a weak, heavy thump against the solid oak of her front door. It came once, followed by a long pause, and then the slow, sliding friction of dead weight sinking against the wood. Sela stood. She did not wake her sister immediately. Moving with the quiet, practiced steps of a woman accustomed to walking unseen, she crossed the uneven floorboards. Her fingers tightened around the worn leather grip of the silver-tipped knife. The cold radiating from the door seeped through her woolen shawl. She slid the heavy iron bolt back, a metallic scrape that echoed loudly in the quiet room, and pulled the door inward. A massive figure spilled over the threshold in a collapse of snow, dark fur, and the overwhelming scent of raw copper. Alistair Thorne lay motionless on the frost-rimed planks of her porch. The Sovereign of Winterstone Keep, the man who had publicly dismissed her as worthless less than a day prior, was reduced to a shivering, broken shape. His heavy wolfskin cloak was saturated with half-frozen blood, the deep crimson standing out starkly against the pristine morning snow. Sela did not scream. She did not drop the silver-tipped knife. Her breath caught for a fraction of a second, the only betrayal of her shock, before a lifetime of medical discipline overrode all other instincts. She dropped to her knees on the freezing wood, ignoring the biting cold that immediately soaked through her skirts. She pressed 2 fingers against the icy skin of his throat. His pulse was a frantic, shallow flutter, struggling beneath the surface like a trapped bird. The pale, waxy tint of his face indicated severe blood loss, but the strange, bruised discoloration around his jaw whispered of something far more lethal than mere steel. Not frostbite, but venom. Certainty settled in her chest, like a stone dropping through still water. She sheathed her blade and leaned closer, analyzing the ragged breath escaping his lips. "Nellie," she called out, her voice flat, steady, and entirely devoid of panic. "Get up. Put the large iron kettle on the fire now." Sela Sterling appeared from the back room within seconds, rubbing sleep from her eyes before freezing at the sight in the doorway. She took in the blood, the sheer size of the fallen king, and her sister's unyielding posture. Nellie did not waste time with questions. She moved to the hearth, immediately stoking the dying embers and swinging the heavy iron pot of river water over the rising flames. "Take his left side," Sela instructed, grabbing the thick wool of Alistair's tunic near his collar. Together, they dragged his dead weight across the threshold. It took a massive, coordinated effort to pull the king into the center of the room. The floorboards creaked under his bulk. Sela kicked the front door shut, sealing out the biting northern wind, and immediately knelt beside him in the dim, flickering light of the awakening fire. Alistair's breathing was deteriorating into a wet rasp. The source of the bleeding was a massive, ragged slash across his right shoulder, the torn flesh concealed beneath layers of ruined leather and wool. Sela did not attempt to undress him gently. She drew the silver-tipped knife and drove the sharp point under the hem of his tunic, slicing upward through the thick, blood-stiffened fabric with calculated force. The cloth parted, revealing the brutal reality of the strike. The wound was deep, cutting through muscle, but the sheer volume of blood was not the primary threat. The edges of the laceration were tinged with a sickly, necrotic grey, the veins around his collarbone swelling with dark, corrupted lines. Sela touched the skin near the injury. It was burning with unnatural, localized heat, entirely at odds with the freezing temperature of his hands. "Poison," Sela said quietly, pulling a clean linen cloth from her apron. "Southern nightshade, mixed with iron rust. It accelerates the bleeding and stops the heart." Nellie brought a wooden basin of boiling water from the kettle. Steam billowed into the cold cabin air, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the river. Sela grabbed a handful of dried willow bark from her indexed pouches, crushing the brittle strips in her palm before dropping them directly into a separate, smaller pot of water to steep. The willow bark infusion would reduce the fever, and buy his body the time needed to fight the venom. Dipping the linen into the scalding water, Sela wrung it out and pressed it directly against the gaping slash. Alistair groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony escaping his cracked lips, his massive hand twitching on the floorboards. Sela kept her movements incredibly steady. Her knuckles whitened as she applied relentless pressure to the wound, cleansing the corrupted blood away with methodical precision. She had spent her entire life observing, learning, and preserving the delicate balance between life and death. The man beneath her hands had discarded her before his lords, yet as she worked the boiling linen against his poisoned flesh, she treated him not as a sovereign, but as a body that simply required saving. Alistair Thorne shuddered beneath her touch, his skin burned, radiating the unnatural heat of mercenary venom. Built for warfare, he lay stripped of armor, reduced to ragged breath. Near the far window, Sela Sterling stood with crossed arms. She kept silent watch over the snow-drowned valley, guarding the perimeter while Sela managed the brutal work of the flesh. Sela pulled back the torn edges of his blood-soaked tunic to clear his collarbone. A folded square of parchment slipped from a hidden interior pocket, hitting the floorboards with a faint tap. She paused, the object seeming entirely out of place amidst the gore. Wiping her fingers on her apron, Sela retrieved it. The parchment was slightly damp, yet folded with deliberate care. She opened it slowly, flattening the creases in the amber firelight. Inside lay the pressed winter flower. It was the rare violet bloom she had carried at Winterstone Keep, the fragile specimen that slipped from her grasp when the court erupted. The petals were preserved immaculately. He had kept it, tucked against his ribs, shielded beneath iron chainmail while he fought the southern trackers to the death. Sela held the flattened violet. The silence in the cabin deepened. She stared at the petals, letting the knowledge settle into her chest like cold water seeping into stone. The sovereign who had dismissed her as worthless had retrieved a fallen weed, guarding it with his life. She did not weep. Instead, she folded the parchment over the bloom, placed it on the stone mantelpiece, and returned to her labor. She packed the steaming poultice into the deepest part of the poisoned wound, binding it tight with clean linen strips. Her movements were steadier now, anchored by an immovable certainty. Hours stretched into the grey expanse of mid-morning. The blizzard waned, leaving Whispering Glen buried under unbroken white. Sela sat on a low stool, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Eventually, his violent shivering ceased. The unnatural heat radiating from his skin receded, replaced by the steady warmth of a healing body. The bitter medicine had neutralized the toxin. Alistair let out a long exhale. His eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, before slowly opening. His gaze clouded for a fraction of a second before finding her. He did not thrash or demand to know where he was. He simply anchored his vision on Sela, taking in the dried blood on her apron and the warm walls of the remote cottage. He shifted, wincing as the muscles in his shoulder pulled against the tight linen bandages. His thick right hand slid across the rough grain of the table. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split from the impact of armor. "You are alive," he rasped. His voice was a low whisper, stripped of the booming authority he wielded in the great hall. It was a statement of exhausted relief. Sela did not move away. Her posture remained straight. "You went to great lengths to ensure that, my lord." Alistair's fingers tightened against the wood. His gaze rose to meet hers with absolute directness. "Gregory, Vane is a butcher. He takes, and he breaks what he takes. When Lord Vane demanded you as tribute, the entire court was watching. He swallowed hard, the effort causing him pain. He owed her the unvarnished truth. If I had shown even a fraction of hesitation," Alistair continued, his voice steadying, "if I had shown the council that you held any value to me, Vane would have realized your true worth. He would have known you possessed the medical archives. He would have brought his southern army to the gates of the keep to claim you. The elders would have handed you over in a heartbeat to avoid a slaughter." Sela listened in perfect stillness, the memory of his voice echoing off the stone walls, declaring her not worth fighting for, had lodged between her ribs like cold glass. Now the context shifted, realigning the geometry of the past 2 days. "So you made them believe I was nothing," she said quietly. "I gave them a lie they were eager to swallow," he answered. "I made you a ghost. It was the only way to get you out of the fortress alive. I knew you would come here. I knew this valley was defensible. From the shadows," Nellie turned her head, her sharp eyes assessing the sovereign. She did not interrupt, but her presence was a silent guard, ensuring no manipulation occurred under her roof. "I hunted the ones who did not believe the lie," Alistair said, his hand sliding a fraction closer to hers on the table. He did not try to touch her, respecting the boundary she had drawn. "The trackers who followed your trail into the forest. They will not report back to the southern envoy." Sela looked at his bruised hand. then up at his exhausted face. He had traded his honor to build a wall around her, enduring the judgment of his peers, to ensure her breath continued in the freezing dark. "You bled for a woman you publicly discarded," Sela noted, her voice devoid of accusation. "I bled to keep you safe," Alistair corrected softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I would do it again tomorrow." The fire crackled, spitting a solitary amber spark against the stone hearth. Nellie stepped into the space between the cot and the wooden table, her arms crossed firmly over her linen apron. The older sister did not care that a king lay bleeding on their modest mattress. She cared only that the frosted side was kept where it belonged, and that the men who had brought it were held to account. Sela remained seated on the three-legged stool. The confession hung in the warm, cedar-scented air. It would have been easy to lean forward, to let the relief of his words wash away the lingering sting of the public rejection in the great hall. She did not. She had spent enough of her life learning that words, even protective ones, were merely air until anchored by structure. She looked at the sovereign, noting the pale exhaustion drawing tight lines around his mouth, the way his broad shoulders remained rigidly still to avoid tearing the stitches she had just sewn. "Protection is a debt, Alistair," Sela said, her voice dropping into the quiet rhythm of the room. "And I will not owe the crown for a rescue I did not ask for, nor will I return to Winterstone Keep as a ward of the court." He watched her, his breathing shallow but steady. He made no attempt to push himself upright, no attempt to assert the physical dominance that another alpha might have relied upon. He waited for her to finish. Nellie shifted her weight, the wooden floorboards creaking under her boots. "This valley is ours," the older woman added, her tone brokering absolutely no argument. "The cottage, the surrounding timber, the herb cellars. If you remain here to heal, you remain as a guest. When you leave, this land belongs to the Sterling name. No pack tithes. No unannounced border patrols demanding shelter. No sovereign decrees overriding our locked door." Sela watched the king process the terms. They were demanding absolute independence, severing the traditional hierarchy that bound every pack member to the central keep. It was a staggering demand to make of the man who ruled the entire northern territory. Alistair did not argue. He did not flinch at the audacity of two low-status women dictating territorial law to him while he bled on their linen. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of respect tilted his head. "The Whispering Glen is yours," Alistair rasped, the words thick with fatigue, but carrying the absolute weight of pack law. "Recognized as sovereign ground. No guard crosses the tree line without your express permission. No tithe will ever be collected from this soil." He looked directly at the younger sister, his dark eyes stripping away the artifice of the court. "I did not come here to reclaim a subject, Sela. I came because this was the only safe place left." The tension in Nellie's shoulders marginally relaxed. She reached for the iron poker, turning her attention back to the fire, though she kept herself positioned between the king and the heavy wooden door. The boundary had been drawn in stone and blood, and for the first time since leaving the keep, Sela felt the distinct, unshakable certainty of her own ground. The heavy quiet of the cottage was shattered an hour later by 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks against the thick oak planks of the front entrance. Nellie stiffened, her hand instantly dropping to the heavy iron skillet resting on the stove. Sela rose, her movements measured and silent, retrieving the silver-tipped knife from the table before moving to the threshold. She unlatched the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door inward just enough to see the visitor. Thomas Croft stood on the porch, an imposing silhouette framed by the blinding white of the morning blizzard. The head of the border guard was covered in a thick layer of frost, his heavy wool cloak frozen stiff at the hem. He looked less like a warrior and more like a man who had been carved out of the winter storm itself. Sela pulled the door wide, silently stepping aside. Croft moved into the warmth of the room, his heavy boots leaving clumps of dark, melting snow on the floorboards. He took one look at Alistair resting on the cot, his shoulders sagging in a momentary, silent release of tension, before he began unfastening his frozen cloak with numb, clumsy fingers. Before the guard could force out a single word of his report, Sela was already moving toward the hearth. She did not ask him for updates. She did not barrage him with panicked questions about the assassins in the woods. Instead, she took a heavy ceramic mug, filled it to the brim with a steaming, dark amber liquid from the iron kettle, and walked back to him. She pressed the hot pine broth directly into his cracked, freezing hands. "Drink," she instructed quietly. "The cold has settled in your chest. Your words will wait until your blood remembers how to move." Croft looked down at the mug, then up at the quiet herbalist. A profound flicker of gratitude crossed his weathered face. He lifted the ceramic rim to his lips and drank deeply, closing his eyes as the bitter, vital heat of the pine and ginger worked its way down his throat, chasing away the bone-deep chill of a night spent slaughtering rogues in the snow. Only when the mug was half empty did he finally speak, his voice raspy and low. "The southern perimeter is clear," Croft reported, his gaze shifting to Alistair. "The hunters who tracked you are dead. I buried them under the deadfall near the ravine. No one at the keep knows they made it this far." Alistair shifted on the cot, his jaw tightening as the willow bark infusion fought the pain in his shoulder. "And Vane?" Croft set the mug down on the wooden table, the sound heavy and final. "Lord Vane is not waiting for your return, sire. He has sealed the inner gates of Winterstone Keep. He is telling the council that you abandoned the territory to chase a meaningless grudge in the woods, leaving the pack defenseless against the plague." The room went perfectly still. The sound of the wind howling against the wooden shutters seemed to amplify the gravity of the betrayal. "He is calling for a tribunal," Croft continued, the grim reality settling over the small room. "Vane intends to use the emergency succession laws. If you do not return and present a solution to the sickness by the next moon, he will force the elders to strip your title and hand the northern borders to the south." Sela let the information settle into her mind. The political machinery of the keep was moving exactly as she had always observed it, ruthlessly, efficiently, and entirely without honor. The southern envoy was using her disappearance and Alistair's absence not just as a distraction, but as a weapon to dismantle the sovereignty of the entire pack. She looked at the empty ceramic mug on the table, then toward the locked iron chest in the corner of the room. The survival of the North no longer depended on brute strength or border skirmishes. It depended on the meticulous, documented truth she had carried out of the keep in a single wooden trunk. The wooden table stood between the hearth and the frosted window, its surface scarred by decades of chopping root saps and grinding mortar. Sela moved the ceramic medicinal bowls aside to clear a flat space. She reached into her canvas satchel, her fingers brushing past dried yarrow, and carefully withdrew the heavy, parchment-bound volume. The leather cover was brittle at the edges, smelling faintly of dried lavender and old dust. It was the only tangible inheritance she possessed, an archive of knowledge that the Grand Court had entirely ignored. She opened the mother's journal under the amber glow of the firelight. The pages were thick and yellowed, dense with faded ink, meticulous diagrams of root systems, and precise chemical measurements written in a disciplined hand. Alistair shifted his wooden chair closer. He did not crowd her, maintaining a careful physical boundary, but the breadth of his shoulders brought him near enough that his tunic brushed against her linen sleeve. The proximity carried the distinct scent of ozone and cold iron, grounding the quiet space in his observant presence. The herbalist traced a pale finger down a column of botanical notations. She did not speak of the public humiliation, nor did the sovereign offer empty apologies. The survival of the pack required absolute focus. She pointed to an anatomical sketch of a parasitic fungus known to grow only in the southern wetlands. Beside it was the recorded counter-agent, a complex formulation involving a concentrated dose of the willow bark infusion, crushed charcoal, and dried sovereign root. He leaned forward, his sharp gaze tracking the text she indicated. The realization settled over them with the weight of dropping stone. Lord Vane had not sought her out of mere territorial greed. The southern envoy understood that the northern border guards were already succumbing to a weaponized version of this illness. Controlling the pack's quietest healer meant controlling the only archive of the cure, holding the Northern Defense Network hostage without drawing a sword. They spent the next hour detailing the logistical realities of the plague's spread. The king calculated the supply routes the southerner would likely use to transport the infected grain, his voice low and measured as he mapped the conspiracy across the frozen territories. She provided the strict incubation timelines, proving mathematically how the sickness was designed to peak just as the heavy winter storms sealed the mountain passes. Their collaboration was built on cold facts, undeniable ledgers, and shared intelligence. Every tactical observation he made regarding troop movements was instantly met with her precise botanical evidence. It was an alliance forged over dry ink, bitter herbs, and geographical maps, solidifying a deep mutual trust that required no ceremonial oaths. By the time the morning sun crested the eastern ridge, casting long, sharp blue shadows across the deep snowdrifts, the preparations for their return journey were complete. The interior of the small cottage smelled of banked embers, dried sage, and tightly packed provisions. Nellie moved with crisp, unyielding efficiency, securing the thick leather straps on their canvas supply bags and carefully checking the wrapped rations of baked barley bread and salted venison. She handed a heavy, fur-lined traveling cloak to Alistair. He took it with his uninjured arm, the deep stiffness in his bandaged shoulder forcing a slower, more calculated movement as he draped the thick material over his back. The younger sister performed the final, systematic sweep of the main room. Sela wiped the wooden table clean of any lingering herb dust, arranged the ceramic mixing bowls symmetrically on the upper shelf, and ensured the heavy hearth stones were swept completely clear of loose ash. She was not leaving a place of desperate banishment. She was meticulously organizing her own private sanctuary. Her movements were calm and deliberate, honoring the quiet, invisible labor that had kept them alive through the longest night. The silence in the room was not the oppressive, mocking quiet of the keep, but the comfortable, resonant stillness of a completed task. They stepped out onto the frost-rimed wooden porch. The bitter northern wind immediately bit at their exposed faces, smelling sharply of approaching snow and crushed pine needles. The elder sister and the king moved forward toward the snow-packed trail, their boots crunching heavily, leaving the herbalist alone to secure the entrance. She pulled the heavy oak door shut. The thick wood groaned softly on its forged iron hinges, a familiar, grounding sound that anchored her to the space. From the deep woolen pocket of her coat, she withdrew a heavy brass key. It was newly cut, the solid metal cold and biting against her bare fingertips. She inserted the key into the heavy iron lock. The internal mechanism turned with a sharp, heavy click that echoed clearly in the frozen, silent air. Sela kept her gloved hand resting on the brass for a long moment, feeling the rigid, undeniable resistance of the engaged deadbolt. The profound certainty of the moment lodged itself between her ribs like a sliver of cold glass. She was no longer a discarded, invisible worker fleeing the judgment of the court. This cabin was not a prison forced upon her by a political decree. It was her chosen domain, secured by her own hand, entirely under her own jurisdiction. She withdrew the key, letting the cold metal drop safely into her pocket, and turned to face the tree line. The sovereign stood a few paces away on the white path, his breath plummic in the freezing air, waiting to escort her back to Winterstone Keep. Hours later, the heavy oak doors of the great hall did not slam when they opened. They swung inward with a slow, grinding groan of iron hinges, a sound that immediately drained the ambient chatter from the cavernous room. Sela crossed the threshold without hesitation. She wore the same simple, dark wool travelling dress she had packed before the blizzard, the fabric still carrying the faint, sharp scent of wood smoke and dried yarrow. She did not look like a woman who belonged in the centre of the sovereign court. Alistair walked entirely in step beside her. His posture remained rigid, his heavy cloak draped strategically to conceal the thick linen bandages binding his poisoned shoulder. He did not lead her by the arm. He merely occupied the space to her right, a silent, looming presence that demanded the attention of every territorial lord seated at the long table. Lord Vane sat near the head of the assembly, swirling dark wine in a silver goblet. His smooth, performative politeness cracked slightly at the sight of her. He had expected her to be shivering in a forest, unguarded and easily claimed by his mercenary hunters. Sela stepped directly to the centre of the oak table, unclasped the heavy leather satchel at her hip, and drew out the mother's journal. The ancient, parchment-bound volume hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud. "You demanded a tribute to settle the border dispute," Sela said. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the cold stone walls carried her measured cadence to the furthest corners of the room. "You claimed the southern territories required compensation for the plague. You claimed your borders were vulnerable." Vane set his goblet down, his knuckles whitening against the silver stem. "The herbalist speaks out of turn. This is a closed council." "She speaks with the authority of the crown," Alistair stated, his tone a low, unhurried drawl that left no room for debate. He leaned his weight slightly against an empty chair, his gaze fixed on the southern envoy. "Listen." Sela opened the mother's journal. The brittle pages crackled, releasing the faint scent of crushed sage and old ink. "The sickness is not a natural plague. It is a localized toxin, introduced through the grain shipments crossing the southern pass." She flattened a page with a steady, ink-stained finger. "The fever only affects wolves who consume rations, treated with an alchemical preservative manufactured exclusively by your estates." Vane stood abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the stone floor. "This is a fabrication, a desperate lie from a discarded woman trying to buy her way back into the keep. The evidence is not philosophical, Lord Vane. It is botanical, and it is absolute." Sela withdrew a secondary sheaf of papers, shipping ledgers recovered from the assassins Alistair had intercepted in the woods. "Your men carried the antidote in their saddlebags, while your council demanded territory as the price for a cure. You engineered a crisis to fracture the border guard, and you sought to eliminate the only apothecary capable of synthesizing the willow bark infusion that neutralizes it." The words were pressed into the silence of the hall like a seal into hot wax. She did not raise her voice. She simply laid the mathematical and medical reality of his treason on the table, dismantling his political posturing with quiet, undeniable academic authority. Vane looked toward the doors. Thomas Croft already stood blocking the archway, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword. The southern envoy was trapped by ink, ledgers, and the steady composure of a woman he had deemed irrelevant. "Treason?" Alistair said, the word dropping into the room like a stone into deep water. "The penalty is exile, effective immediately." Sela closed the journal. The crisp snap of the parchment finalized the verdict. She stepped back from the table, her posture perfectly straight. The wind on the high castle balcony was bitter, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and impending snow. Below them, the vast expanse of the Northern Territory stretched into the darkness, the distant silhouette of the Whispering Glen barely visible against the tree line. Sela stood near the stone parapet, letting the freezing air clear the stifling atmosphere of the council chamber from her lungs. The deep quiet of the night felt like a protective mantle, airy and unburdensome. It was no longer the silence of endurance, but the quiet of a finished task. Alistair stepped onto the balcony behind her, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading to reveal the deep physical exhaustion of his wound. He did not crowd her against the stone. He stopped a respectful distance away, leaning his uninjured shoulder against the granite pillar. "Vane's carriage is gone," Alistair quietly offered. "Croft is riding with him to the southern border to ensure the transition of power. The cure is already being distributed to the guard outposts. The willow bark must steep for an hour before consumption," Sela replied, her eyes fixed on the distant forest. "If they rush the boil, the medicinal properties will fail." "They won't rush it, they have your instructions." He paused, the sound of the winter wind filling the space between them. "I meant what I said in the hall, Sela. You are not a tribute. You are the architect of this survival." She finally turned to face him. The moonlight cast sharp shadows across his jaw. He was the most powerful man in the territory. Yet he looked at her not as a subject, but as a sovereign in her own right. Alistair reached into his heavy cloak. When he withdrew his hand, his fingers were wrapped loosely around the leather hilt of the silver-tipped knife. He had taken it from the cabin table before they rode back to the keep. He stepped forward, offering it handle first. He did not speak. He was not asking her to lay down her weapons to remain beside him. He was returning the very tool she used to protect herself, acknowledging her fundamental autonomy. Sela accepted the knife. The cold metal settled into her palm, familiar and grounding. She slid the blade smoothly into the sheath at her belt, the quiet click securing the unspoken covenant between them. From the deep pocket of her wool dress, she retrieved a small folded piece of parchment. Opening it carefully, she revealed the pressed winter flower she had dropped on this very floor, what felt like a lifetime ago. Alistair had carried it through the blizzard, through the blood of the ambush, and returned it to her in the warmth of her hearth. She held it between them, the fragile violet petals completely intact, despite the violence of the past 2 days. "I am not returning to the laundry," Sela said softly, her voice steady against the wind. "No," Alistair agreed, the corner of his mouth lifted in a faint, unguarded expression of warmth. "The archives require a keeper. The border requires a master herbalist. And I require counsel from the only person in this keep who refuses to flatter me. The work will be extensive. We have the winter." Alistair did not reach for her. He simply remained beside her, watching the snow begin to fall over the northern pines. It was the kind of safety that did not need to be forced or declared loudly to the world. Tomorrow, the ledgers would be updated. Tomorrow, the pack would begin to heal. But tonight, standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing air, Sela looked out over the territory and knew she had built her own sanctuary. The sovereign of the North was simply a man choosing to stand beside her in the quiet.